So today we're going to hear from Chris Adams, the Executive Director of the Mental Health in the Church Initiative at Biola's Rosemead School of Psychology. Uh, for more than 2 decades, Dr. Adams has provided evaluations for clergy candidates to both mainline and also evangelical traditions. We were talking about this earlier today, and Chris mentioned that he's performed close to 1,000 evaluations of clergy candidates over the past 20 years. Today, he's going to be presenting on formative evaluations of clergy candidates across these traditions. And I think you'll find both the information as well as the conversation that will emerge to be really engaging. So to get things started, I'll just say welcome. And we really look forward to your presentation today, Chris.
Thanks so much, Thad. Joy to be with you all, and so honored that you're here. Particularly honored to see Dr. Laleen Rector on the call. Laleen is one of the people from whom I learned how to do this work as a graduate student and beyond, and so really honored to have you on the call, especially Laleen. Thank you for being here. Nice to see you. We need to catch up, which we'll do, and wanted to share a brief story of how I got interested in this. So I'm a third generation pastor's kid, been around pastors all my life, and got into an associate pastor position. And during seminary, first senior pastor I worked with was amazing. All the kinds of things you would long for and hope for in a senior pastor, especially of a large church. And we had a senior pastoral transition, and unfortunately the church did not choose well the second senior pastor, who had not been through a process like what we're going to talk about today. And I watched as someone who I now understand to have a really deeply ingrained, what traditionally has been called a personality disorder in clinical psychology, very narcissistic, somewhat sociopathic. He was very manipulative, but very high IQ, extremely high IQ, but almost no self-awareness. And I watched what that combination created when you put someone in a position of power in a faith community. And it was, of course, incredibly destructive. And people don't really understand what's going on, and people point to all the wrong things. And it's just very destructive, even traumatizing for people when leadership does those sorts of behaviors. And so I got really interested in and even prayed, God, if I could be a part of preventing what I've just seen happen to this church that I dearly loved, and help guide me. And it wasn't long after that I met a man named Dr. Richard Hunt at Fuller, where I was a grad student, who Laleen knows well, who had created the process that's still used by the United Methodist Church for clergy candidate evaluations. And he was a big mentor and influence in my life in this. So been doing this work for quite a long time. I'll have maybe a couple of stories I'll share along the way. It's work I've become passionate about and love doing, largely because you get to hear amazing stories and meet amazing people and hear how God has worked in their lives to bring them to faith and call them to some form of vocational ministry. So I want to share a couple things, and then we're going to send you back to small groups to discuss here in just a minute. But I think of this as I've started using the language of formative evaluation, because that's really my hope in the way I approach this. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about clergy assessment, and that is what it is in many ways, but using the word assessment just increases everybody's anxiety. They know they're being evaluated and assessed, but what we try to do is draw people in a collaborative way, and have them think about themselves, so do some self-evaluation, and also ask them to approach using the time with me as a consultant. What do you want to know about yourself that maybe you've always wondered about that I could try and answer, and really try to help people, draw people into a collaborative kind of evaluation that really speaks into their deep holistic spiritual formation. So I want to talk about why we do this, um, and then what it is that we want to evaluate, and then how we evaluate it. Those are kind of the three things I'm going to try to cover in a short amount of time. But the rationale for this, there are, of course, biblical qualifications for leadership in the church, and there are many places we could look at that, Old and New Testament. But I think, for example, of First and Second Timothy, and some of the lists of qualifications for leadership and what are the underlying core competencies there, if you really do exegetical homework on those passages. So there's biblical basis for this. And we also know that emotionally healthy pastors and leaders positively influence emotionally healthy congregational systems. Now, that relationship is reciprocal, it goes both ways. Used to say that healthy pastors create healthy churches, and I think that's some ways true, but that's also oversimplified. So it's a much more nuanced reciprocal relationship. But generally speaking, if we can get people on a healthy trajectory in terms of their own emotional well-being, self-awareness, those kinds of things early in their career, then that trajectory tends to stay positive for the long haul, even if they do encounter really dysfunctional congregations and challenging kinds of ministry contexts. We also know pastoral ministries, it's uniquely joyful, but it's also uniquely stressful. And so we like to do a bit of a stress inoculation on the front end and help people understand how they tend to cope when they're stressed and what coping strategies might be they want to continue and what do we need to add to their repertoire, if you will, because we know they're going to be stressed and at some point in a ministry leadership role. And so we want to help people think about that. We're also trying to prevent clergy misconduct, and this is kind of the screening out part of this, that we want to try to look for major psychopathology kinds of things. So, for example, risk of harm to children or to vulnerable adults, a kind of person that would be a predator that would use a position of power in the church to gain access to vulnerable people and children in order to exploit them and meet their own needs in an unhealthy kind of way. We want to prevent that. Those are the stories we all know too many of and hear on the news. So we're trying to screen that out, and there are ways to catch much of that or most of that and screen that out. There's also a due diligence here from a legal perspective for denominations, for churches, for districts, for ministry organizations. When someone does engage in misconduct and there is a lawsuit, then if there hasn't been due diligence in personnel selection and placement and accountability structures, those kinds of things, then that lawsuit often then also applies to the denomination or the organization because they didn't do their due diligence on the front end of personnel selection and placement and hiring and so forth. We want to contribute to personal and professional growth of the clergy themselves in core competencies. Um, what we don't know for denominations that many of you work for that have a process like this in place, what we don't know is how many people are self-selecting out of the process of becoming ordained in that particular denomination because they don't want to go through an evaluation like this. And in my opinion, that's not a bad thing. If people are self-selecting out of that process. In fact, I've seen this happen in systems where we put a process like this in place and they didn't have it before. People self-selected out of the ordination process. Now, people can go get ordained online in 5 minutes, unfortunately, if they really want to, but at least someone is speaking into their growth, both personally and professionally. So the way I like to approach this with people is to say, you have a place of ministry just as a disciple of Jesus Christ in the church. So we affirm that. We want to help you figure out what's the best place for that. Is that necessarily parish leadership? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And that's what we want to help you discern and speak into that because we know some of what that role requires of a person on a number of levels. So we want to help people grow regardless of whether they become ordained or not, because most people that come through this process are going to be fairly healthy people that just need to pay attention to some things proactively to maximize their strengths and protect their vulnerabilities. And the information that's generated in these processes can also be really helpful in placing clergy. So whether it's an appointment type of system or a more congregational polity, putting the right pastor in the right location is a big deal with respect to long-term flourishing. And so to really think through goodness of fit is a big deal. And so we can use the kind of information that we have to do that. But what is it that we're evaluating? A lot of times when I get asked to consult with a denomination, they'll start asking me, well, what tools should we use? Should we use the Myers-Briggs? Should we use Strength Finder? Should we use the Enneagram? Should we use the MMPI? What tools should we use? And those are important questions, but the first important question before we get to the tools, in my opinion, is what are the competencies that you want to evaluate, and to really define those competencies. And so I think of those in three categories. I'll just review these quickly. Intrapersonal competencies, meaning within a person, things like their spiritual life, their personality, their temperament, extrovert, introvert, those kinds of things. Their motivations, um, that sometimes they're not fully aware of. And so we try to discern what's motivating this person to move toward a career in vocational ministry. How healthy are they psychologically, emotionally? Self-awareness is a big deal. You see EQ there, emotional intelligence. What kind of trauma history does this person have, and how resolved is that? Why is that important? Because we know that they're going to get exposed to trauma one way or another, in a clergy role, either directly or vicariously. And if they have a really complex trauma history, especially from childhood, that hasn't been addressed, that trauma can get easily triggered and impair people in really, really profound ways. So we want to evaluate that. There's psychological defenses, which of course all of us have. We need them. But the question is, are they mature defenses or not? And then we look at physical health, uh, because we know clergy have a higher rate of stress-related physical health issues, and physical health can also be a window into some other things. So those are the kind of intrapersonal competencies. Interpersonal competencies between people, relational things like attachment style, how well do they connect with people and communicate with people. More important than it's ever been, or someone's experience with conflict. How do they tend to respond to conflict? What kind of training do they have in that? Just given the polarization that's happening, at least in the United States politically, and all the conflict that converges on clergy right now. I just hear a lot of conflict fatigue, even from pastors who handle conflict well. It just is never ending. And so having those skills and capacity to develop those skills is really important. Maintaining appropriate boundaries, healthy boundaries, and being able to submit to their own formation and accountability in some way. Those kinds of interpersonal competencies. If they're married, we of course want to also evaluate the health of their marriage and their marital history, as well. And then vocational competencies. Um, what are their talents, skills, strengths? How might what are the implications of their personality for leadership style? The kind of role that they might be best suited for at this point in their development, in what kind of context. We look at educational history. Certainly, we need a certain level of education. Many denominations require that, at least a bachelor's degree or an MDiv. We also look at employment history. A lot of folks are coming into this work as a second career, and sometimes that's wonderful, as they bring many, many transferable skills. They've had a lot of leadership experience, for example, or organizational leadership experience in their other role. Other times, it's something to pay attention to, because they have an employment history of having a lot of different jobs, not being able to keep a job maybe for more than a year or two, and jumping around to different kinds of careers. And that's always something that's a window into potential, at least yellow flags or red flags. There could be deeper issues that are driving that, personality issues that would mean we would not recommend someone move forward for ordination. So employment history can be really telling. Financial history: does a person have a history of declaring bankruptcy, home foreclosure, those kinds of things? Just because that can speak to deeper emotional issues, or the inability to be disciplined and organized, those kinds of things. And you've got to manage a church budget, typically, if you're going to be a pastor. So we look at those kind of competencies as well. So I think what we want to do now is maybe go back to some small group discussion, that based on what I've shared so far. When we come back, I'll share more of the how do we do this? What are some of the principles and actual tools that we use to do this? But I'll pause right now as we think about why do we do it, and what is it that we're evaluating in terms of competencies.
All right, welcome back, everyone. At the end of our time together, we're going to have time for some Q&A. So I'd encourage you to begin thinking about anything that you'd like to ask about or comment on during the course of the presentation. And you are welcome to put that in the chat at any time. But certainly, if you'd like to reserve it for the Q&A time, you're welcome to do that as well. So I'll turn things back over to Chris, and we're really looking forward to the next part of your presentation.
Thank you. So I was sharing with Thad that I was recently interviewing a clergy candidate, and typically the way this works is a psychologist will get all of the life history and all of the results from all the instruments, the reference forms, everything I'll share with you in advance, and then we go through all of that. And what we're looking for, where those sources of information converge and corroborate one another. And usually for most people, in my experience, there are 2-3 major themes that emerge that really need attention in some way, even if they're not necessarily clinical recommendations like need for therapy or a psychiatrist or something. There usually are 2 or 3 major themes, like a person is lacks assertiveness and needs to grow in that area and conflict resolution training or something like that. Um, but I prepared ahead of time, like I always do, for this conversation, and sat down with this clergy candidate. And first thing he said to me was, "Well, I should probably just tell you up front, I don't do feelings and I don't like people very much." And so I thought, well, okay. I said, thank you for being upfront about that. And it did, that all kind of did show up in his results. So I said, well, let's talk about what kind of fit this might be for you as a role and a job that's going to involve a lot of feelings and a lot of people, and working with people. And maybe we need to think about what might be a better fit for you, and that kind of conversation. Um, and so again, and sometimes I've had the experience of people actually being grateful and feeling sort of freed up when they realize, this really isn't a fit for me. And I don't think it is God's voice leading me into this. I think it's some other motivation that I need to resolve. And thank you for helping me see that, because this would have been a disaster for the church and for me. I think I'm better in this lane over here, that kind of thing. And so it is a difficult conversation when people feel very called and passionate about it. And me as a psychologist, the church may have real concerns about that. And those can be hard conversations. I know some of you have when you're the judicatory leader that has to make the final decisions. But I want to share with you some of the principles that guide how I think about doing this work, and then how do we think about how we actually do it in terms of the kinds of tools that we use. So the way I think about this is really nested in the broader context of spiritual formation in a person's journey. And we want to do a holistic evaluation. So biopsychosocial, socio-spiritual approach. Many systems require full physical as well as the psychological evaluation that the psychologist would have access to the results of, a criminal background check, a credit check, so that there's some of these other sources of information that give us a whole picture of how a person is functioning in all of life. And really what we're doing here is using multiple methods and multiple sources of information. So it's why we use multiple psychological instruments of different types, and the other sources of information I'll show you. So no one conclusion or recommendation about a person is made from just one instrument or just one source of information. We're able to triangulate and corroborate multiple sources, and I'll share more about that in a moment. I also like to remind denominational leaders of the limits of psychological assessment. The tools that we use are really sophisticated, they're really helpful. They also have limits, not the least of which are cultural biases at times, or language limitations, depending on a candidate's first language. There are a lot of these instruments available in a number of other languages, also with cultural norms from other cultures, which is important to use cultural norms for comparison instead of comparing a person of color, for example, to a largely, white European set of people in terms of how their scores come out. But there are limits to that need to be nuanced and taken into consideration. And the psychological evaluation is one source of information that judicatory leaders are using to make decisions. It's a heavily weighted one, I think, when it's utilized well, but it's also not the only one. So there are other things that people are considering. And so I always like to just acknowledge the limits of these instruments, mainly because they're self-report. So in other words, it's just what the person is saying about themselves. Now, the sophisticated ones that we use have all these kinds of ingenious ways that they can correct for people trying to appear better than they really are, worse than they really are, those kinds of things. But they still have limitations. So it's important not to give them too much weight as if they are the voice of God or have powers of divinity in some way, but also not to undervalue the feedback as well. It's kind of that in between place of not giving it too much credit, but also not dismissing it. I've gotten many phone calls from DSs or bishops who kind of ignored a report and later wished that they hadn't, because they moved forward with ordination with someone that we recommended they not move forward with. And now, how do I deal with this kind of person in this kind of situation? Um, and part of the limits too have to do with the fact that personality is only one factor to consider. There was a quest, I think it was in the 60s, in Christian higher ed to determine the ministerial personality. Like if we could figure out the profile of who is going to be an effective pastor. And as you might imagine, that was a futile enterprise because ministry is way too complex and very contextual, and God uses all kinds of different people. God seems to call people at times into things in scripture that they're actually not very good at. So, as much as I believe in strength based kinds of things, there's a lot to weigh here, even theologically and spiritually, to consider. Um, but we do want to think in terms of core competencies, in my opinion, because we are screening out people that we don't think are fit and likely won't ever be fit to be in a particular ministry leadership role, to have power, to have influence over people, to have access to vulnerable people or the vulnerable parts of people's lives. Those kinds of things include, as I mentioned, really complex, unresolved, untreated trauma, personality disorder kinds of things like full-blown narcissism, um, uh, active addictions that haven't been addressed or treated. Um, those are some of the kinds of things that are big red flags. And sometimes we do catch these kinds of things on the front end. Many of the people that would bring those types of major issues into a process like this self-select out of the process. But we still find some of these things, and then we're able to speak into them, get people help, whether or not they move forward in ordination or not. Sometimes I feel like God uses this process just to get people connected to treatment that they might not have otherwise chosen to get connected to. And I would say, in my experience, I haven't researched this. This is a ballpark, but probably 5 to 10% of folks that go through a process like this have really serious clinical issues, that they're either in crisis at that moment and need immediate attention. I've actually hospitalized a couple of folks out of their clinical interview, into a psychiatric hospital because they were in such mental health crisis. That's rare. Um, but about 5 to 10% of folks have really concerning clinical issues. About 30% have issues that may need to be attended to at some point in the not too distant future, if they're going to really flourish over the long haul. They're going to need to invest in some therapy or marital counseling, or see a physician about something. And I've seen many people lean into those recommendations, by the way, and I'll bump into them, 5 years later at a retreat or something for their respective denomination, and they're in a totally different place in terms of much healthier, on a healthy trajectory, because they really took the advice and really leaned into a formational plan that they were held accountable to by a mentor or someone in their respective denomination. Most people, though, it's a screening in, and by that I mean, let's think about your strengths. And many people don't see those clearly because they haven't had those mirrored back to them well, perhaps, or thought about how do I do what we call job crafting around those strengths in a ministry role at least 60-70% of the time. How do I configure my role and my time around the things that I'm most gifted in, most passionate about, etc. And then what vulnerabilities are people going to need to pay attention to? We all bring vulnerabilities into this work. And so helping people think about being proactive to put things in place that will help them address those vulnerabilities in an ongoing way and even have accountability to do so is really more of the conversations than the screening out conversations in my experience. And then I make a necessary connection. The screening out's really important, obviously, and that's important for all kinds of ethical and legal reasons. We want to protect the church from abusive leadership. It's one of the main goals, at least in my mind. I tell people I'm trying to weed out the socio-pastors one at a time. That's my goal in life, to do that. Um, but it's also an awful lot of time and money and information to just sit there. If we say, okay, yeah, they're fit for ministry, but then we don't really optimize all the other information that's sitting there, then I think that's a huge miss, in my opinion. So to take the implications of the report, even for healthy folks, and then go somewhere with that. What are the implications for their own personal and professional development? Even if we're saying yes, there are clinical concerns, they're healthy, they here are their strengths, here are some vulnerabilities. Let's help them think about strategically putting together a personal growth plan, and then have a coach or a mentor, someone journey with them at least through their first 5 to 7 years of ministry experience as they're forming a pastoral identity. Even if they are doing this, switching midlife from another career, um, hear this all the time from clergy candidates. I've been in leadership and education or in business for years, but being a pastor is a different thing. Those skills are helpful, but there's still complexities and nuances to this that I wasn't anticipating. And so having support that is informed by this in-depth assessment process can be enormously helpful to folks. So I think I'll stop. Oh, wait, let me talk about the tools. Sorry, my last slide. So then how do we do this? So different denominations have different models of this, and often what we're trying to do is maximize the bang for the buck, so to speak. Um, and by the way, I do make the case all the time that yes, this does cost money to hire psychologists, to pay for the testing, all this stuff, but it's much, much cheaper to do that for everyone than even one lawsuit when clergy misconduct is involved and you haven't done your due diligence. And so it's a proactive investment that is well worth the time and money involved. But the tools, again, we're using multiple tools, multiple sources of information. We want to get background information on a person. So there's an extensive life history questionnaire that people fill out typically, which just speeds up the interview process for the clinician involved because they already have a lot of background information. Usually I only have 90 minutes to spend with a person. And so I go into that 90 minutes knowing what I need to ask about, what I need to find out more about. But having that background information is helpful. Sometimes denominations have information about a person. They've watched this person in their real life, and they've already got concerns. They've already seen some things that they would be cautious or give them pause. And so it's always helpful to have that information. And it's also helpful to understand how a candidate approaches the process. Everybody's a little bit anxious, at least, about this because, of course, you're filling out all these instruments and talking to a total stranger and the psychologist for an hour and a half about your life. You don't know what you fully revealed about yourself. And there's a lot at stake for people in this process. So it's normal for people to have a certain amount of anxiety coming into this. But if their anxiety is really excessive, if they're really angry about it, excessively angry about it, those kinds of things are also telling. They're also information. It's one other source of information that is often corroborated by the information in the testing, or things as simple as they can't ever get anything in by a deadline, they can't seem to finish the instruments. That can be adult attention deficit disorder kinds of things. That is also diagnostic in some way. We use personality inventories, at least one clinical tool, meaning it's a sophisticated tool like the MMPI. There's another one called the PAI that are looking for clinical issues, not only depression, anxiety, um, uh, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, all those kinds of things, but also deeper personality brokenness that would be really problematic in a pastoral leadership role. And then I like to also use a normal personality inventory. So this would be something like the 16PF or a tool called the NEO that's looking at just descriptively how extroverted or introverted is someone, how open to new experiences are they, how conscientious are they, those kinds of things that aren't necessarily a better or worse for pastoral ministry, but tend to help us think about the implications for this person's development and what kind of role makes the most sense for them at this point in their journey. Um, one of the denominations I work with, we actually do live experiential initiatives. So the candidates that are being evaluated are in a small group with the psychologist who is doing their individual evaluations for about 6 to 8 hours. And we've created group initiatives that feel like they're playing a game to the people involved. So they kind of forget themselves a little bit because they're having fun and engaged in the process. And then the clinician just gets to watch how they behave in a group of people for 6 to 8 hours. And it's fascinating how often something that's showing up in the testing plays out in real time, just watching people behave in a group for a number of hours. And so it's one more source of information that can be really, really helpful. So, for example, one of the tasks is to there's a bunch of construction paper and paper clips and post-it notes and all kinds of office supplies in the middle of the table, and they're given in silence, given instructions, and they're all given slightly different instructions to build a church. Some are told to build the tallest church you can, some are told to build the most beautiful church you can. I forget what the other different instructions are, but they're not allowed to talk. So you set them up for conflict without them realizing it because they have different agendas going on, and you just watch how this plays out. Who's overly aggressive? Who's overly passive? How do spouses interact with each other in this context? And it's just one more source of information that can be really helpful. Um, Also, like to try to get feedback from references in some kind of way. So it's because these aren't self-report. These are people that have seen folks out in their real life, in their ministry context over time, and give them some meaningful categories to give some feedback about a person from several different sources. And we look at the aggregate of that, and that can be a really helpful source of information as well. And then, of course, the clinical interview itself with the clinician. Part of that is the my experience of the person, my own what psychologists call countertransference. How do I experience them in the interview? Is part of the information that I'm weighing as well. And then, of course, all the information I gather in the interview. We often also like to give some feedback in that interview. And part of the reason for that is I want people to know the feedback so that they can grow. And in the case of needing to refer them to other mental health professionals, we talk about that and how to make that happen. But it's also helpful to see how they respond to the feedback. And so people that are healthier tend to want to grow. They want to learn about themselves. They're eager. Oh, yeah, that makes sense because this and this happened, or this is the way my family of origin was, or I've absolutely seen that, in my ministry leadership. It's an area where I need to grow. How do you recommend I address that? That kind of thing. Or if there's a real excessive defensiveness, I go, I don't think that any of that's true. I don't believe that. I don't see that. Then that's also, of course, telling. And sometimes reinforces some of the other sources of information that would give us concern that a person isn't self-aware and they're not really interested in being on a journey of becoming and growing into more self-awareness. And that's going to be a really difficult trajectory for someone who wants to be in a leadership role in the church. So um, those are the kinds of tools we use. And again, it's all of that together that tells a story and usually highlights two, three, four major themes for most clergy candidates that either are clinical or developmental recommendations or both that we write in a report that then goes to adjudicatory official, and there are informed consents involved. Of course, you have to have all that in place because in this case, the church is the main client. So the candidate themselves are a secondary client, and we get their permission to share all of their information with whatever denomination it is. But the church is the primary client. So the report is written to the church about the candidate, and you've specified in the informed consent who can see the report. And usually that's a very limited group of people, which makes sense. You want to keep that to just people that absolutely need to see it because of the nature of the confidential information involved. And then that informs the decisions uh, that leaders and committees are making about ordination and moving forward. So I'll stop there at that, and we can maybe do some Q&A.
Absolutely. All right. So if you do have a question, please feel free, or comment, please feel free to pop it in the chat or use the raise hand function. We are a little bit pressed on time because I know that Chris has a hard stop at the hour. I want to go ahead and kick things off with a question, but feel free to pop something in the chat or to use the raise hand function. So Chris, I'd be curious what you might say to a denomination or judicatory that is undergoing this process. If you could kind of say, I've seen people do it really well, and these are the things that they do it, or here's like I've seen this over and over again happen. It's a mistake. Don't do it. So either the kind of positive or the negative, you can take it however you want.
Yeah. I, two immediate things come to mind. That's a great question. One is to just not have any kind of discernment process at all. And we can tend to look at calling an ordination in a very individualistic way at times. So in other words, if somebody says God called me, then okay, great, here's a church. And I'm being a little facetious, but sometimes it's about that way without any discernment, any evaluation of any kind. And I would contend that God's voice in that vocational discernment includes the voice of the church that you're a part of, and you're asking people are asking to be given power and authority in the church. So I think the church has every right to vet people in a way that's consistent with Scripture and church history and the best tools that we know of to help us do that. So to totally ignore this would be one. Um, I think the other extreme would be when a denominational leader's gotten a report that raised some concerns, and then they would say to a candidate, well, the psychologist says you shouldn't be a pastor. And I'm maybe raising some concerns, but that's also not the psychologist's decision. That's the church's decision. And so to misuse that information in a way that it sort of passes the buck, if you will, can also be problematic. The final thing I was thinking about that is when a denomination does have this process in place, they get a report that raises major concerns, for example, risk of harming minors, and they ordain someone anyway for other reasons, and then that person engages in misconduct, you're actually legally in a worse position that you were warned and didn't heed the warning than if you hadn't done the evaluation at all. And so to either not do it at all or to do it and ignore it are really problematic.
Yeah, that's really strong. What do you think about in terms of so Mark Dance asked in the chat, what are the credentialing thresholds that you recommend for giving and interpreting a psychological assessment?
Meaning Mark, do you mean the credentials of the psychologist?
I think that's the way he said it.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
for really anybody, I mean, because some of how do lay people interpret? Because you're right, some self-report, you determine, those different kind of tools, as you said, clinical and normal, but
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't know how to do it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think you really do need to engage a qualified mental health professional. Um, but there's some caveats to that. So, not every Christian therapist works well with clergy, first of all, but they also have to understand psychological assessment. And sometimes people don't really do much of that after they get out of grad school. So, having kept up with psych assessment and understand clergy well, so to have some more advanced kind of specialized skill, and there are folks out there who do really get how to do this kind of work well, um, but typically they need to have at least a master's level license, often a doctoral level license, to be able to do these kinds of assessments well from a psychological licensure perspective. But it's just, those are state-based licenses, so it depends on the state and the scope of practice that's outlined in a given licensure level. But often it has to be a clinical psychologist, which is usually a doctoral level person, um, overseeing that process because of all the intricacies involved and
Yeah,
in the interpretation and doing that well.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So next question is from William. He says, what checks and balances are in place to mitigate potential bias in interpretation of these assessments? And so if I can just layer on, there was something I was thinking about because I know in my own experience, it's a bit of a political process as much as it is a faith process or a theological process. You know, you're engaging in a political act as well. And sometimes I've found that in my experience working with a either a clinical professional or the committee that is receiving their results, that it's actually saying something about them versus the
Yes.
candidate themselves. So what checks and balances are do you
Yeah.
recommend?
Great question. Some of that I think has to be with respect to biases in the instruments, the training, for example, the intercultural competency of the psychologist who's doing those evaluations, who knows how to think about all those things appropriately. Um, there also can be a consulting function that I feel with judicatory leaders, especially because those change, every several years sometimes. And so there can be a learning curve and sort of a teaching of how do you best make use of this information, um, and even have some kind of standards for that, some benchmarks for that. Um, I think that's often why there's a committee as well, for denominations that do this well. So it's not just one person looking at a report and making a decision. There's a communal discernment around it, that has diverse representation, for example. Um, Ideally, that's the case too. The other thing I would say is, often uh, um, candidates have the permission to write a response to the report. So if they want to interact with it in any way, expand on something, even disagree with something, they can do that in writing, and you keep that report, that with the report. So the candidate has a chance to speak into the process too if they feel like something was unfair and accurate. Um, I've honestly yet haven't had that happen in over 1,000 reports. Most people would say that was very fair and accurate, and helpful
That's great. And
most of
then
the
I know
time.
we're
Yeah.
pressed for time, but I'm going to give you the lightning round.
Yeah.
So one last question here. So Laleen Rector said, what are the most pressing, prevalent challenges that you are seeing now in these assessment processes? I'm
Mm.
particularly interested in the seeming ubiquity of different levels and kinds of trauma. So what are the most prevalent challenges you're seeing in these assessment
Yeah.
processes?
Yeah. I would say, I think trauma as an umbrella probably sums that up. In fact, I've started using, what's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs, tool that's free, and it's in a bunch of different languages. It just asks about different kinds of trauma in childhood, because there is research to suggest that people that go into pastoral ministry as a group of people have a higher rate of trauma history than the general population. And that may be a good thing in some ways because it sensitizes people to be compassionate and so forth. But how addressed is that? How resolved is that? How complex is that? Those kinds of things are often the question. So I think that's right on. And then just post COVID, especially for younger candidates, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, I guess is the one after that. More complex, severe mental health issues just across the board. So people are coming into candidacy with a life, they're 25 years old maybe, but they've got a lot of years of anxiety or depression, um, more so than maybe previous generations. And which the positive side of that is they're often much more open to talking about that and facing it and addressing it, and still can be very effective in ministry if they pay attention to certain things. But that's the other thing I would say.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'll just kind of note here is we're concluding that, it's an interesting theological conundrum when you look at the way that Jesus qualifies people to ministry, and he selects people that likely would have problems in terms of some of the assessments that we've talked about.
Yeah.
He did not always choose the best, the brightest, the
That's right.
most qualified, or maybe the most integrated, but instead Jesus called a different population.
That's
And so
right.
I really respect, Chris, the conversational, prayerful discernment kind of that is
Yes.
involved in this as well. Well, I know that we could spend a lot more time talking about this topic as well as a number of others, and I'm sure that there'll be future opportunities to do that.